Hello everyone, Loremaster of Sotek here, back with another video, and you probably are thinking to yourselves, what could he be talking about today? Maybe it's Skaven? No, not yet. Granted, you probably didn't ask yourself that because you saw the thumbnail, but regardless, that's right, today we are talking about the potential Lizardmen lords for the free LC slot that we know for a fact will be coming along with the Serpent and the Rat, as I call it, DLC. I don't think that's what it's actually going to be called, it's just what I'm calling it because that's the name of the famous war between the two. Well, not so much the war itself, but that's kind of a famous phrase that's used to describe it. In any event, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm actually going to go down this list in a specific order rather than just like hitting randomly, and I'm going to start with who I think is the most likely and work my way to the least likely. So the character I cover first, in my opinion, is going to be the one that's like, this is who I think, and I would like, if I was a betting man, would put money down, is going to be the free LC Legendary Lord for this DLC, and then, you know, work your way down. So without further ado, let's head into it. Alright, so the first character I'm going to talk about today is the one featured on the thumbnail, which is Gor-rok, the Great White Lizard. Now, this guy is one of my favorite characters in the entire Warhammer universe because he is just such a badass. If you haven't already, I would highly recommend tuning in to the most recent Who Would Win episode, which was episode 4 over on it's on my channel, where the final battle features Gor-rok, and I go super into depth about him versus his opponent, and it was a lot of fun talking about it, but let's kind of talk about him as a potential lord option. So for those unaware, Gor-rok is basically the biggest, baddest Saurus that has ever been produced by the spawning pools of the Lizardmen. He lives in the city of Itza, so already we have a really good, unique start position for him, because Itza is way out of the way from the rest of the Lizardmen start positions. And it's also the big 10-slot city, or 12-slot city, I forget how many slots it is, but it's the really big city in Lustria. But Gor-rok is this stubborn, huge colossus of a Saurus who is noted for being very, very, very difficult to kill. That's kind of his whole spiel, is that he even has this unique rule called resilience, which just represents how hard it is to kill him. Where, you know, like cannonballs and chariots and all sorts of things that could typically do a bunch of damage at once, if it hit Gor-rok, or even something like a magic weapon that could kill someone instantly, if it hit Gor-rok, he would just shrug it off. Or he would negate it down to doing like a single wound or something like that. So you could hit him with a cannonball to the face, or a bolt thrower to the chest, or you could stab him with a blade that's supposed to like instant kill people, and he'd just be like, yeah, whatever. Like, that's just what he does. That's his whole spiel, is that he's this very slow, tanky Saurus. The other thing that, so first of all, that already would make him really fun and competitive in my eye, is that tanky characters are really fun and a difficult challenge, I think, to do, because right now the characters that you find on foot, which he is explicitly just an on foot guy because that's just his fighting style, and he's a character I would genuinely be upset if they gave a mount to, because I think it would kind of go against everything he stands for and his fighting style. Because the thing with Gor-rok is he has this giant shield, and it's one of his magic items, and it's called the Shield of Eons. And this thing is huge. It's this colossal shield made of this incredibly heavy, durable volcanic slab that it took like 20 Kroxigors to carry to a temple city, where over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years, a bunch of skinks chiseled it down to this big old shield, and Gor-rok is the only Saurus who can pick it up and wield it one-handed. And on top of being super badass looking, it also has these 2 gnarly hooks on the front of it, so it functions very well as a weapon. But the thing that Gor-rok does that's super funny is that whenever something charges at him, he just takes that big shield and just slams it down in front of him like a big barrier. And basically, there is nothing on Earth that's going to budge that shield once he lodges it into the Earth and puts his weight behind it. Like, you might as well just be running into like a wall made of nothing but steam tanks for all your effort. And it was literally so heavy that not only did it make Gor-rok have the highest armor of the foot characters in the Lizardmen army, but it also made it so that if you charged into his shield, while he, like, if you charged him, he'd plant his shield and you'd run into it and just, you had a reasonable chance to just die. Like, it would just, you just smack, it was literally had a rule that you were basically charging terrain, because that's just the way Gor-rok is, and I love that so much. So, you know, I'm imagining a character who has a ton of armor, easily the highest armor of any of the Lizardmen characters, has a silver or gold shield against missile fire to represent his super big colossal shield that's amazing looking. First of all, I love the artwork for it. And second of all, you know, it's just, it's big and pretty much impenetrable to most weapons. And then he should also have charge defense against all. You know, just makes sense. I don't think there's a way to implement for him to do damage to people that charge him. At least I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I don't know if the game has any kind of, like, system built in for, like, creating a small surface that if people charge into, they take damage. I can't think of anything that comes to mind. It seems like people would just stop. But basically, he should just have a super high mass target that, like, he should just have super high mass, like the highest mass of the Lizardmen infantry characters at least. And once he plants that shield, he just doesn't go anywhere. Like, that should be the goal. But that's not his only gimmick. He has immune to psychology, which is always super great. You know, if your lord doesn't cause terror, then you really want them to be immune to psychology so they don't ever break from terror. You know, they'll sit and just keep fighting. And that's Gor-rok. Gor-rok was also stubborn in tabletop, which doesn't have a direct correlation in Total War Warhammer, because the way stubborn worked was it made it so that your character was basically immune to negative modifiers on their leadership. So you know how in Total War your character can get leadership debuffs like being surrounded by superior enemies, or being attacked in the flank or the rear, or being surrounded, or, you know, just all those things. Gor-rok basically had a rule that made it so that he ignored all those penalties, and his leadership would just stay at a really high value, so the odds of him breaking and fleeing from a combat were just super tiny. So I imagine he'd have incredibly high leadership to essentially emulate that. And then finally, he has a melee weapon called the Mace of Ulamok, and it basically just made him hyper accurate in tabletop. You know, it allowed him to basically reroll any failed dice whenever he was swinging. But it's just this big old mace that he flings around with one hand and just destroys people's faces. I imagine he'd have pretty significant AP damage, because, you know, that's kind of what you would just expect from a Saurus character. I don't see him having, like, anti-infantry or anti-large bonus, but I do see him just having pretty high weapon damage with significant armor-piercing ratio, and then I would just probably have him have an active for the Mace of Ulamok that, if he triggered it, you know, would increase his melee attack and melee defense substantially to represent that it kind of gives him, like, a supernatural edge in battles, because it basically, the mace kind of has a sentience of its own. It sort of moves where it needs to not only defend for Gor-rok, but also to seek out people's weak points and just destroy their faces. It's kind of like it was a mace that was designed to find enemies' weak spots and kill them, which is awesome, and I just love that concept. So, for starting location, we already talked about putting him in Itza. As far as the way his army would work, I imagine he'd kind of be more like a one-man army tank, as opposed to like a really good general or something like that. So I could see him having, you know, like, stand your ground if you built up his red tree all the way. But I imagine most of his focus would just be about making himself as tanky as possible. The only other thing I could see is that maybe, like, for starting traits, he could have some kind of system that improves the Saurus he travels around with. So, like, if you take him, maybe you get, like, a melee defense or armor buff to Saurus in his faction or in his army, or a starting experience bonus. But he's definitely kind of a one-man focus character, and his whole thing is just that he is a relentless monster that once he's given a mission or a task, he goes and he just laser focuses in on that assignment no matter what happens. The only other things I could see for him is I could see him having a reduced casualty timer. So if he does die in combat or gets wounded or something, I would see him only being, like, maybe being gone for, like, maybe -1 or -2 on his returns, as he's just resilient and bounces back easy. I could also see him having a very, very high casualty replenishment for himself. So not for his army, but like for him. So if, you fight with Gor-rok in a fight and he loses 50% of his health, then if you pop an encampment stance or whatever, he gets back to full really quick. But he's definitely a character who I would imagine having a very strong focus on just being a really powerful combatant and just being super tanky, and he's what you rally and build your army around. So that's it for Gor-rok. He's the one I feel like is the most likely, but, with free LC Lords, I have often been wrong because it literally feels like shooting in the dark sometimes with free LC Lords. Like Tretch, Tretch wouldn't have even been on my list. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to second place. Now we're on to a fan favorite for many people, though I have already seen quite a bit of argument about him in the video I posted yesterday, but let's go ahead and talk about him, Nakai the Wanderer. So for those unaware, which is probably a fair amount of people, because if you're not super aware of Lizardmen characters, you might not have heard of him because he doesn't show up in the army books, except for typically as like a little passage. But Nakai is the closest thing there is to a special character for Kroxigors, or a Kroxigor legendary lord. Because for those who, maybe, I say that a lot. In the Lizardmen, there are 4 species. For those who don't know, I say that like 1,000 times. Anyway, for the Lizardmen, there are 4 main species that make up what are the actual Lizardmen, which are Kroxigors, Skinks, Slon, and Saurus. Like, all the dinosaurs, like salamanders and stegodons and stuff, those aren't actually lizardmen. They are natural creatures of the Warhammer world that the lizardmen have basically trained or coerced into doing their will or becoming beasts of burden or beasts of war, but they're not lizardmen, if that makes sense. They're just kind of like animals. They're like what dogs are to us. They're different species that, even if they kind of look similar, they're not at all. Lizardmen are the creatures that come out of the spawning pools and were specifically created by the old ones for a certain purpose. So for Nakai, he is one of the oldest beings in the Lizardmen empire. Like, the only people who are probably older than him, maybe Mazdamundi, maybe Kroak, and that's like it. Lord Kroak would be older than Nakai, but that, Lord Kroak's technically dead, so I don't know if he counts in your list or not. But Nakai is ancient. We know that he is a first spawning of the Kroxigors, which means that when the Kroxigors were first created, he was one of the originals. Which is, like, that's a big freaking deal for Lizardmen. Because for whatever reason, the old ones, whenever they created something, the originals tended to be the best. And everything that came afterwards was, There are, of course, been exceptions, like Gor-rok and Tenenhuan, but for the most part. So, Nakai has a really integral relationship with the old one, Quetzal. Which, Quetzal is the old one who's kind of known as, he's the old one that focuses on defense, or he's the old one that is represented by armor, or tough hides, or unbreakable bodies, and unbreakable willpower, and unbreakable strength. Like, he's this old one that epitomizes the defensive nature of the Lizardmen. So, Lizardmen, like a Saurus spawning of Quetzal, would have thicker scales, or larger shields, or they would be more... their minds would be more inclined to defensive tactics and all of those kind of things that make up that nature of combat and armor and style of fighting. So Nakai is very, very tanky for a Kroxigor. Not that Kroxigors aren't inherently tanky, but they're kind of like most monstrous infantry creatures, where they have a fairly tough hide, and that's basically it. That's all they've got going for them. They're not the best fighters, so they tend not to have a really good defense. They tend to be very slow, and don't react very quickly, and don't swing very quickly. Like Throg. Throg doesn't have a ton of armor. He's fast moving in a, like, literal movement sense, but when it comes to swinging his weapon, he's pretty slow. You know, that's kind of the way Kroak are as well. Well, then there's Nakai. Nakai is ancient as hell, but he's also much faster than you might think initially, and much more skilled. He is almost... Although Kroak were originally spawned to be construction workers and kind of the hard-headed bodybuilding heavy lifters of the Lizardmen, it seems that the initial spawning of Kroak was during a lot of the opening wars, and Nakai definitely fills the role as a warrior much more than as anything else. Because in his existence, he had his weapon, which is known as the Sacred Blade of Quetzal, crafted for him. Which, by the way, anyone who... There's a lot of people who, if you bring up Nakai, are like, "Brr, Nakai's not like a real character. Brr, like, he's only in a single passage, and I don't like him." Brr, 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 brr. Okay, so let me get all of this straight, where all this information is coming from, before everyone loses their shit, of that Nakai is a legend. He's not a myth. He's around and is like an actual thing. But Nakai is this really powerful Kroak who wanders around Lustria and the Southlands and other random parts of the world sometimes. And he basically shows up when the Lizardmen are in desperate need and will join the fight. And every time he shows up for a fight, the Lizardmen win. Nakai might be terribly wounded himself, like incapacitated level of wounded, but he always ends up surviving. He always gets back up later. And he just journeys constantly to wherever the Lizardmen need him most. Most of his lore and like the really in-depth details about him come from a expansion after he was made playable for a brief event. There was basically a series. There was a campaign and some events that Games Workshop ran, and they made Nakai the Wanderer for it back in 2005. And his character kind of got really popular as they built up his story, and they vaguely... And he was very popular with everyone that kind of learned about him. So the White Dwarf magazines decided to release an issue that not only talked about that event and, you know, all the details and all the stuff in the news, but you could actually get Nakai's kind of rules that... They weren't official in the sense that you could show up to like a super hardcore tournament and play Nakai, but they were like official enough that you could play him in anything that wasn't like a really heavy, that wasn't considered a tournament. Like you could bring him for fun, and a lot of people did, and he's a very fun character, and a lot of people have built fan models of him. But for anyone out there who maybe is like, "Oh, Nakai didn't even have a model," that's the case for a lot of characters. That's not necessarily like a doom kill for someone. Like, we have a lot of characters in the Beastmen army book, for instance, that never got models. One thing I should say is that in 7th edition Warhammer, they actually released a ton of characters for all the armies, and a lot of them didn't have models until 8th edition, if they got 8th edition books, which is why a lot of the Skaven, actually had to wait forever to get some models like Tretch Craventail and the Hell Pit Abomination, because there was no Hell Pit Abomination model for like years. And like Beastmen, you have characters like Moonclaw or Slugtongue, and they just don't have models. If you want to play them, even though they have official rules, and they were tournament legal, and you could take them whether your opponent liked it or not, you had to create a custom model for those guys. So just because someone doesn't have a model, or doesn't have like a full playable profile in army book, doesn't mean they can't be considered, especially when we have characters like Helman Gorst. Helman Gorst never had a model. He had like a pseudo profile, and the most lore we have about Helman Gorst that's canon is literally a single paragraph in the Sigmar's Blood book, and that's technically end times. That's not like 8th edition. That's literally end times material. So the thing with Nakai is like there is more lore on Nakai that's official than there is on Helman Gorst. Because Nakai got an update on his story in every single edition from 6th edition Lizardmen onwards. He showed up in the 6th edition Lizardmen book, he showed up in the Lustria expansion, he showed up in the 7th edition book, and he showed up in the 8th edition book. Like, he always showed up and did something. And they kind of hint at a lot of the stories that he's a part of. Anyway, now that I have that out of the way, because I know just reading the comments on my last video, I saw somebody was like, oh, I'd love to see Nakai, and then there was like 13 comments of people just going at it. So is he a viable option? Of course he's totally a viable option. I mean, hell, CA's even using like made up characters at this point with the what's her face from the Vampire Coast. So Solostra Deerfawn. So I don't think there's a character that you could look at them and be like, that will never happen. No, that's stupid. You're stupid if you say that. If you point at a character who shows up in an army book in any way, shape, or form, and you say, that person can't be in the game, you're dumb, sit down, shut up. Because there's no evidence to support your claim at all, whatsoever. So anyway, now back onto topic. So, what can Nakai do? Well, like I said, he has the Sacred Blade of Quetzal, which is this really, really giant two-handed great weapon he carries around that seems to have been given to him by the Old One Quetzal, because Nakai was around when the Old Ones were around. And it seems like Quetzal gave him this weapon, and it holds a lot of Quetzal's spirit within it. So kind of like how Kroak wields the revered blade of Tonkslo, who was another Old One. He was the war god. Quetzal, who was kind of more like the god of armor, the god of defense, stuff like that, the god of heavy scales, however you want to think of it. Lizardmen names for the Old Ones tend to be very literal and like to the point. And Quetzal seems to have gifted his greatest artifact to Nakai. And this blade is super powerful. It hits like a truck. Like, there are greater demons who wish they could hit as hard as Nakai can. There are dragons who wish they could hit as hard as Nakai can. Nakai is easily the strongest hitting Lizardman there is when he's wielding the Sacred Blade. Like, he can hit as hard as a Dread Saurian with this thing. It's colossal, and he's colossal, so with his strength behind it, if he connects it with you, you're going to get splattered. And the thing about it is that it is very similar to Gor-rok's weapon, the Mace of Ulamak, in that over time, with Quetzal's disappearance/death after the Great Incursion, it seems to have come to embody what was left of Quetzal's essence, and seems to basically have an awareness of its own. And granted, when they wrote this, don't worry, Nakai's not stealing from Gor-rok. Gor-rok's actually stealing from Nakai. Nakai had these rules written first. So he had the original sentient mace that was a giant blade. This giant two-handed blade that he would swing around, that it would correct his course to allow him to hit people that were like very evasive. And it would also naturally change its course to block attacks that Nakai himself wasn't even aware of. Which, that's a terrifying level of sentience for a weapon, where you're swinging it around and it's like, oh, I'm going to change my angle so I block this bullet or this greater demon's axe that's coming at Nakai's head that he doesn't even notice. So that alone actually makes him into a really scary warrior, because it makes him more skilled than he actually is. And of course, in Tabletop, they represented that by giving him like a ward save and increasing his strength a whole bunch. But in any event, that's his weapon. And he has a couple of really cool abilities. One is that he is a blessed spawning of Quetzal, so Quetzal likely hand-engineered him to come out of a spawning pool, and because of that, Nakai has a ludicrously tough hide with a ton of armor. He is very, very tanky and very hard to wound, because not only is he bigger than all other Kroxigors to the extent that... So in Tabletop, whenever something is a better version of itself, usually we'll represent that by giving it like +1 attack. Like, that's usually a general way to say, okay, this is like the best version of this guy. Rarely are any stats outside of that messed with, and it's usually only on a +1 scale. Like, if you have a super warrior, you might say, okay, give this guy +1 attack, +1 wound, maybe he's a little faster, so +1 initiative, and if he's braver, +1, leadership, and +1 toughness. Boom, you're done. Nakai, on the other hand, compared to like the elite Kroxigors, which are the Kroxigor Ancients that I talked about yesterday, Nakai, we have a guy who has 2 better weapon skill, 1 better strength, 1 better toughness, 1 better wound, 2 better initiative, 2 more attacks than the Ancients, which are the super Kroxigors, and 1 better leadership. So like across the board, he makes them look like a joke. Nakai is more like a dragon than he is a Kroak because he's so big. Like, this guy's fucking huge. And part of his lumbering hulkiness is that he has a ton of... His hide is just super thick and heavy, and his armor is freaking ridiculous. Like, he's basically wearing better than full plate armor just because that's the way his body is. Like, that's... We're talking about a guy who's so tough that he makes Dwarven Gromro like, we could be a little better. Like, that's super tough on this thing. And he's, you know, monstrous and very difficult to harm. He, of course, is albino because he's marked for greatness. And in Lizardmen culture, different spawnings basically mean you have different patterns and different colors on your scales. Which, you know, for skinks, it'll usually be their crests and maybe a little bit of their back scales. For Saurus, there tends to be a unique patterns along their head crest with whatever the color is, and then the color flows down their back spikes all the way down to their tail. For Slann, Slann don't really have spawnings like that. Slann's skin can change colors anyway, depending on certain factors. And Kroxigors, if they have sacred spawnings, which is super rare, theirs are more like Saurus, where they kind of have the fancy patterns on their heads and it goes down to their tails. But anyway, the long story I was getting to is that the rarest and most powerful spawnings are the albino spawnings. Because that just means you have the blessed mark of the old ones, period. It means like all of the old ones, to some extent, were like, this is a perfect design. Like, everyone gave their stamp of approval on that. And blessed spawnings tend to come out by themselves. So, like, instead of an entire unit coming out, it's like one guy. That was the case for... So that was likely the case for Nakai. That was the case for Gor-rok. Gor-rok came out of the spawning pools of Itzel by himself. And the Lizardmen were like, oh, shit. Because normally it's like an entire unit, if not more guys, coming out during a spawning. But Gor-rok and Nakai were both individuals who came out on their own, which was just letting the Lizardmen know, like, these guys are a big fucking deal. In any event, the only other thing worth noting about Nakai is that, and that kind of plays into that he's very encouraging and the Lizardmen are like super into him, and it gave him the ability to have like a buttload of rerolls, but I'm not sure how they would do that in because that's kind of an older rule that from Warhammer or from Lizardmen, so I don't know what they would do to be like, oh shit, he's got the albino marking, how they would represent that in the game. Because the albino marking was literally like the old ones were watching over them to the extent that fate itself would change to favor them. So I don't know how CA would represent that particular role. The last thing, though, is he kind of has a bit of a nature spirit aesthetic going on. And one of the things that Nakai can do is that when he's running around Lestria, the jungle will alter itself to allow him to pass faster. And it also will protect him, in a sense, if he's wounded or needs to fall back. So, like, if Nakai's in the middle of a fight and somebody, like, shoots him in the chest with a gun and he gets deeply wounded and he were to fall down, the jungle would instantly, like, shoot forwards and a bunch of vines and thorns and nastiness would reach up to make a wall and the jungle would just flow over him and, like, nom his body and, like, transport it somewhere else, where the skink priest could start to heal him. He's not like the Green Knight. He's not literally a spirit. He is a physical flesh and blood creature. There's just, like, the forest will just move him to safety. And we've seen that happen before when he fought the great beast of Clan Pestilence, which was this rat ogre that was to rat ogres what Nakai was to the Lizardmen. So it was like a super colossal rat ogre that was unkillable, and it had so much disease. It was basically like a hell pit abomination, but with like a Clan Pestilence theme. So it was just like a diseased abomination of horribleness that was very fast and angry and juiced up on all of the worst drugs you could imagine. And Nakai was the only one who was capable of killing it, and he did, but killing it caused it to kind of like pop like a pimple, and it, like, exploded such horrible filth over him that it, like, laid his ass out. And he ended up being in a coma for a while the skink priest tried to heal him because the diseases were so potent. But Nakai being Nakai, eventually he got better, stood up, and just ran off to go keep fighting. But Nakai participated in the Great War against Chaos, the first one, the Great Incursion, when demons were flooding all over the world. He played a huge role in that war. He was in the Lustrian War against the Skaven, like I talked about, when he killed the Great Beast of Clan Pestilence. And he's popped up in a couple other wars. He just kind of shows up from time to time and does something ridiculously epic, because that's just the way he is. But, yeah, so for the forest thing, I could see CA maybe giving him a doesn't suffer penalties when fighting in forest, which, considering he's a large entity, would be a really good buff on him. Alternatively, I could see him having a buff that whenever he... it also works when he breaks from combat. So if Nakai is ever seriously wounded, or he retreats from battle, so like he flees from an enemy, the forest itself would literally rush forward and tangle up the feet of the people chasing him so they could not pursue him. He was a character who literally was designed so that you could not pursue him no matter what. And he would just pop out of a terrain feature and come mess you up, which was super cool and was a really fun function that just made him really, really fun to play. So the way I could see that being interpreted is like no penalty for fighting in the forest. Maybe he could have his old rule where the more fighting that was going on, so like the later in the game it was, the more likely he was to pop out of a forest and attack. So maybe he could like have a speed buff if he's running towards an enemy, or if he's charging towards a combat. And he always was kind of the guy who would show up in climactic moments. Nakai would make an entrance. He never really showed up like before the battle enough where he could chill with everybody. He would show up like literally when he was needed. And of course, one thing I'd love to see with him is maybe if he broke, like his leadership fell low enough for him to break, if that had a passive that would trigger, that would cause like an explosion around him, to not that did damage, but just to knock people out of his way. And the explosion also like significantly reduced the speed of everyone for a couple seconds to give him like a good chance to get a head start and run away. I think that would actually be a really interesting mechanic. So just as a quick recap, because I've been talking for 20 minutes about one character, super duper tough, one of the most heavily armored monstrous infantry creatures in the game, like or in the Warhammer universe. Like he's basically a dragon, like dragon stat line with a couple minor exceptions, and he can't fly. But he hits really fucking hard. Like, he hits as hard as Kroak Suneater. I'll put it that way. Like, they both had a ton of attacks. They both had pretty good weapon skill, and they're both strength 8. Like, he could hit... Him and Kroak could hit each other really freaking hard. Of course, the difference being that Kroak is a lot bigger. But, yeah, actually, that'd be a kind of interesting fight for a Who Would Win episode. I'll put that on my list. In any event, so, hits really hard... Maybe doesn't have a penalty in forest, maybe has like physical resistance or a ward save for his blade, or maybe just really have melee defense. Some kind of ability or passive to represent his albinism, giving him some blessings, goodness. Super high armor for being a blessed spawning, I already said that 1,000 times. Really good stat line, and maybe able to have a retreatment explosion slow cover to represent the forest, trying to give him a head start so he could retreat, because the world itself wanted Nakai to survive, because, you know, it helps when you're blessed by ancient gods who created a lot of things. In any event, yeah, that should do it for Nakai. I think I've waxed randomly enough. Let's go ahead and jump over to number 3 then. Yep. The third person to talk about is, of course, none other than Lord Kroak. I'm not going to go super lyrical on him today, because we already sort of talked about him a bit in the video earlier this week, the first one. But I will say that as a legendary lord, he is possible, even though I do think he'd be a little weird. Just because Lord Kroak is kind of, well, first of all, he's dead. So he's like, he doesn't really do a whole lot. He doesn't talk. He doesn't move. He doesn't communicate in any way. The Lizardmen don't really have a way to open a dialogue with him, because that's something they certainly would have done many, many times if they could. And unfortunately, he just seems to be in his own little ether world. That being said, I suppose Total War Warhammer has already opened up the, what do you call it, a tube of snakes, or a can of snakes? Because now that I think about it, when watching the Lizardman campaign, Lizardman Vortex campaign, that Relic Priest definitely talks. So I guess Lord Kroak can talk now. So never mind, I guess he's viable as a lord, because, I mean, I still think he'd be a little funny because he doesn't move, but I imagine they would somehow represent his spirit to do his, like, attack animations, because otherwise it would literally just him like just floating around and like people randomly getting like swatted aside by just nothing, which would be kind of hilarious. I will admit I love the idea of a floating corpse just like drifting into a big battle and like a bunch of enemies surround him and he like doesn't even move and all of a sudden they all scream and get thrown back flying as just nothing just plows into them. But if he were to be a lord, I imagine he would focus much more on being a general and being a support character than being like a super powerful caster. Because the thing about Lord Kroak is that in the last few editions, actually, he can only cast one spell, which is the Deliverance of Itza. Granted, he had different versions he could cast, like 3 levels. So like the first level was more close to him and every level just got bigger. And basically, Lord Kroak is just a walking nuke who just goes boom, 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 boom constantly until he's either out of magic or everybody's dead. Which, I mean, Lord Kroak would never run out of magic because he's Lord Kroak, but you get the point. Most of his abilities and items completely have to do with just making him difficult to kill. His golden death mask makes it so that like his overbearing will can just snuff out yours, and it makes you just go slack-jawed and just void your bowels as he stares you down with his golden stare of death. And it just makes him pretty much immune to shooting. Not immune, but it makes it very difficult to shoot him, very difficult to attack him. It basically made him just have the equivalent of hilarious melee defense and missile resistance. Or just a lot of resistance to everything. Like, he just had this ridiculous ward save. He had the highest ward save in the game, on top of being ridiculously hard to hit. I think the only character that had better defenses than him was probably Archaon, but Archaon was also a lord who would run around and have to be fighting constantly, whereas Lord Kroak would just park himself in a giant unit of Unbreakable Temple Guard and cackle as he just exploded and wiped out entire swaths of an army every time he cast his spell. So if they were to use him as a character, the only way I could see him working is he would have to be a character who had like a really, really strong defense with really, really good general abilities that would make him useful when he's not casting magic. So he would need to be unbreakable. He would need to probably have the ability to make a local unit unbreakable, either kind of like Throg's Crown, where he just clicks on a unit and is like, hey, you're unbreakable for a certain amount of seconds. Or it would need to be something like he would need to have a super powered version of Stand Your Ground that would be unique to him. Because I can't see him having a very good attack animation, or like having good attacks. Like, I can't imagine his weapon strength being very high or his melee attack being very high. And then of course he should have his spell, which should either come with 3 levels, or because it's his only spell, I think I'd prefer if they made it so that he just had 3 spells, which were the different versions. And so you had the super version, the medium version, and the little version. And he should just float into battle and just start blowing the crap out of people. Because that's what it did. It was literally a direct damage. There was no way to avoid it. There was nothing to save you. You were just doomed. And he could cast it rapid fire. So I would imagine it would have a fairly low cooldown for the shortest version maybe. And then the cooldowns could go up for the bigger versions. And the little version should probably be very localized. And the other thing that it did is it did the same amount of damage no matter which version you used. It literally just determined how far it reached. So, which would be kind of an interesting concept for him to have like a super powerful spell, but he has one that like only hits people in melee range, another one that hits maybe people in like throwing weapon range, and then not like maybe like half that, and then the last one being like a really long range one that can blow up like an entire large engagement. And of course, being Lord Kroak, it only hurts enemies. It doesn't hurt allies because he's too badass for those silly friendly fire stories. But he'd be interesting to see. I think he would be a difficult character to do justice to as a legendary lord. I think he would make more sense as kind of like a Green Knight-ish character. Someone you could do some kind of series of events to basically open his vault, or his tomb. It's technically a vault, but, open the tomb in which he's stored his body. And then the Lizardman, like, once you accomplish that task, he gets brought out and can lead armies and is like a super badass character. which I don't know if that would transfer to him being available in multiplayer. It probably would, because everyone else is available in multiplayer, except Kihar the Tormentor and the Zinch dude, which I'm surprised the Norskin players have not kicked up a fuss about, but whatever. In any event, so that's Lord Kroak. Let's go ahead and pop into Skinksville down the road and wrap this up. Alright, the last two characters we're going to talk about, or we're going to kind of cut to the chase with these, which is, first, let's look at Tiqtak'to. So I talked about Tiqtak'to a little bit in the first video, or no, yesterday's video, because we talked about his Regiment of Renown, the Sky cohort, who could be a good Regiment of Renown for the Lizardmen. Now, these two characters I think are very unlikely, because I don't see them doing a double skink release. You know, I think I'm looking at, you know, Tenenhuan is the main DLC release, and then some other kind of Lizardman, which we have already covered now, a Saurus, a Kroxgor, and a Slon. We have all bases covered, you know? So, as for these two, all I'm really going to say about them is that if you wanted to do a Skink Chief Legendary Lord, you would go with the Tiqtak'to. He's a very, very skilled combatant. He doesn't have any ranged weapons, but he makes up for it by being one of the best fighters, second only to Tenenhuan when it comes to skinks. And he's kind of an assassin-y role, though he's more like a vanguard. He basically is this beautifully gifted pterodon rider who rides on his very large, mean pterodon named Zwup. And Zwup is a big old beastie that is so big compared to most pterodons that once he drops his rock and it's no longer like weighing him down, he actually gains the killing blow ability because he's big enough to pick up people and then just drop them and let them splatter on the ground. And Zwup, that's like his whole strategy. And he's also lightning fast. And so it would be kind of awesome I would just represent that with an anti-infantry bonus in melee. I would probably have it active all the time instead of just after the rock drops to save easiness. But basically, that would be the way I would represent that, just because Wup is large enough that he can basically just screw over man-sized individuals. But in any event, other things about him is that Tiqtak'to has this weapon that basically gives him a massive bonus when fighting against flying units, which should be doable in the game. Because I know that we have Roiling Skies for the Lore of Heavens that makes it whenever you cast a spell, all flying units take, damage, and we have spells that explicitly target flyers, like the Warp Storm Scroll, and of course the different spells. The Von Karstein has the ability, and we have that Tempest from the Lore of High Magic. So if there was any character who should have a really powerful, like, anti-flying ability, like, instead of anti-infantry or anti-large, like, anti-flying, then it should be Tiqtak'to. Because he's one of the very few characters in the game who actually has a bonus that allows him to do a lot of damage to enemy flyers with his sword. So I would really love to see either his sword become an active that just just massively increases his melee attack and damage against enemy flyers, or maybe just create an anti-flyer stat, which would kind of be awesome. Why don't we have that? We should have that. Why don't we have that? That's a great idea. I should make like a video about that or something. That's kind of a cool idea. I don't know why I just thought of that. But in any event, that's Tiqtak'to, so let's talk about the other gecko in the room. The last character we're going to be talking about is Tetto'eko, who is the Herald of the Cosmos, a skink priest out of the City of the Moon, also known as Tlaxlan if memory serves, and he's basically a pure skink priest character. He's this super old skink, which he's a little over 100 years old, which for skinks is very old. Obviously, Tenenhuan is like a couple thousand years old, but Tenenhuan's an avatar of God, he cheats. Tetto'eko is basically just the premier Lord of Heavens caster. So if you really like the Lore of Heavens and you're like, who in the Warhammer world is recognized as the best caster of the Lore of Heavens? Tetto'eko is your man, skink. He is this, so he has like a bunch of items that basically allow him to read the stars with freakish accuracy, which allows him to essentially predict the future. And he also has a little device on his staff, if memory serves, that allows him to more accurately call really, really big comets out of the sky and just wreck everything. He actually is the one credited with wiping out the Skaven capital in Lustria. The Ratmen were trying to make a return to the continent of the Lizardmen. And Tetto'eko not only foresaw this, but he went out there and fought them, and with his future-seeing ability was able to just completely dominate them. And then he dropped a comet that was so big that it literally crushed the temple city they were hiding under into the earth, flattened the Skaven city under it, and then exploded and just killed everybody. So Tetto'eko is pretty terrifying in his own right. When it comes to a lot of the other super heavy lifters he's up against, obviously he doesn't seem quite as OP, just because that's the nature of Lizardmen, but he is a very, very powerful character. In any event, though, as far as if he were in the game, I would probably put him in Tlaxcalan, the City of the Moon. It's a little closer to Luther Harkin, but I don't think that would be too big of a deal, considering how close some other characters in the game are. I would have him probably have Vanguard deployment for his entire army to represent his future-seeing abilities. On top of that, I could see him having like really, really good ambush defense chance. He should probably get some additional bonuses to using the Astromancy stance, which is a unique stance to the Lizardmen they have in campaign. That's actually really good. I don't know if people use it that often, but it's actually very strong and allows you to see super far on the campaign map. But other than that, I would probably give him bonuses to getting Skink Priests. Like, he should probably allow you to recruit more of them and get them at a higher starting recruitment rank. I wouldn't give him any mounts. He should just have his palanquin like the Slan do, Mazdamundi being the obvious exception. And overall, just a really awesome caster that probably have the ability to do things like, I would have his comet item just have like a bound comet in addition to his Lore of Heaven spells. And then he should probably, have Loremaster Lore Heads and be able to get shorter cooldown and cast the spells for cheaper, or maybe just reduce the cooldowns. But in any event, that's pretty much Tetto'eko in a nutshell. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. That's all the free LC characters that I think that we can cover, there we go, who are viable options. Obviously, there are some other Lizardmen characters, the most notables being Oxyotl and Chakax, but I just don't even see them as remotely possible right now. Maybe in the future, when we see like some other features, because Oxyotl is not an army leader and is purely an assassin, whereas Chakax is a pure bodyguard. So it's kind of hard to imagine them leading armies on their own instead of like finding a way to buddy up underneath legendary lords. If you had to pick Lizardmen to be legendary heroes, I would definitely pick those two to be legendary heroes before anybody else. But in any event, we'll talk about them another time, and obviously we'll talk more in detail about a lot of the characters I've spoken about today, future on when they have their relevant legendary lord video. But that's going to wrap us up for now. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Which of these 5 would you pick to be the Lizardmen free LC Lord we're going to be getting along with the Serpent and the Rat DLC? And is there anything I missed that you think they should have? Or any cool ideas you have for the way to implement some of their abilities and items and such? And I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts. And we'll be back soon with the Skaven side of the DLC. So until then, I'll see you guys around. Thanks for watching, guys.